With extracts from his own diary tapes, former Cabinet Minister Tony Benn describes the power Prime Ministers exercise over their colleagues.
Any Prime Minister, so long as he or she has a majority in the Commons and enjoys the confidence of party colleagues, has immense power at his or her disposal. Prime Ministerial powers are actually Crown powers, and include the power to go to war, to ratify treaties, to approve laws in Brussels, to create peers, choose archbishops, bishops and judges, and to appoint, reshuffle or sack ministers in the government, all without consulting Parliament. In 1975, just after the referendum on Britain's membership of the Common Market, against which of course I'd campaigned, Harold Wilson called me in and said he wanted to move me from the Department of Industry and send me in exile to the Department of Energy. At the time, I was under heavy attack from the Confederation of British Industry and the press, and I told him I'd go away and think about whether I was willing to be moved. Tuesday, the 10th of June. At 6:10, I was summoned to see Wilson. And I went down to his room in the House of Commons, and outside was Bernard Donahue and Joe Haynes and Ken Marks, and it was just like going through running the gauntlet before going to the firing squad. He asked me to sit next to him, and he was looking intently with his piggy little eyes. Harold said, "What is your answer?" And I said, "Well, Harold, I've been thinking very hard about it overnight, and I think before I give you my answer, I'd better tell you my thinking. What you are doing is simply capitulating to the CBI, to the Tory press, and to the Tories themselves, all of whom have demanded my sacking. And I said, if you think that this is going to save you, you've made a great mistake, because they'll be pleased for 24 hours, then they'll turn on you. Well, he said, they'll turn on me anyway. I'm just captain of a cricket team wishing to make changes. It's got nothing whatever to do with the referendum. But I said, in that case, I'm entitled to an explanation as what it is. I've done nothing in the last 15 months that hasn't been cabinet policy. And he said, well, I'm entitled to make changes. Well, I said, let me tell you this. I said, my dad, sat in the cabinet with Ramsay MacDonald, but till the day he died, 30 years later, he always regretted that he didn't stand up to Ramsay. And I said, the moment, very difficult to know, when is the moment to go? And I said, you've never really understood at all that I want to see the policy implemented. And that's what I'm concerned with, and that's what you're cutting away, and that's what the movement will see. It was very plain and very blunt. And then he said to me, well, what's your decision? And he was watching me carefully. Now, looking back on it, it is possible that if I had said no, then he would have kept me. But as I was told he was going to see the Queen at 6:30, and I'm sure she'd had advance notice, I don't think that's so. Indeed, later tonight, he said if I had refused to go to Energy, he would have taken the Department of Industry himself, as he did once with the Department of Economic Affairs. That might or might not have been true. Well, he said, what is your answer? So I said, yes, and I got up. And he said, what did you say? So by this time I was standing. He was sitting at his desk with the back to the window, looking towards the door, and I was standing between him and the door. And I said, yes, I accept. Of course I accept. You can't resign on a personal issue. And I went out and banged the door. Wilson has betrayed the Labour government, and I think he may have made a fatal error. I do not believe that man will be leader of the Labour Party at the end of this year. Indeed, I wonder whether he will at the end of July. I think this is the end for him. 9 months later, in March 1976, Wilson himself resigned, and Jim Callaghan was elected to succeed him as Prime Minister and had to form his own cabinet. I had hoped I might be promoted to become the Leader of the House of Commons or to become the Employment Secretary, and I had a word with Michael Foote, an old friend who had some influence, to indicate that. I also discussed the situation with Francis Cripps, my political advisor, and with Bernard Ingham, who was my press officer. Thursday, the 8th of April, 1976, and a very memorable day. Well, I stayed at the office for a bit, then I went over to the house because I got my car there as I had been going to Bristol. And I got to the House of Commons, and Francis and Bernard and I decided we'd talk about what I should do. I tried to see Michael, but he hadn't in fact arrived, but I spoke to his secretary, who said that, I said, do you know what's happening? She said, well, only what's happening to Michael. So I said, what's that? And she said, Leader of the House. Well, I said, who's getting employment? So she said, Albert Booth. Well, I thought about it, and all of a sudden I realised that if Albert Booth was to go to the Department of Employment and Michael wasn't going to be there, that was where I ought to be. Bernard had said to me earlier, if you go to the Department of Employment in stage 2 of an incomes policy, then you are really heading for failure. Francis Cripps said, yes, I'm persuaded. It's a risk for Jim, but it's also a risk for you. It would please the left, but it would also, in a curious way, please your critics, because they'd say you've been prepared to take responsibility. And the only way you can do it is to argue your case inside, but give a pledge of personal support to Jim Callaghan. You'll try and get it through. That's the key thing, giving him a pledge. Well, I decided I would do it. And I sent another message down to Michael, and Michael came out to about 3:15, and I went to see him. And I said, Michael, what's happening to you? And he said, well, I'm going to be leader of the House. So I said, well, in that case, I'd like the Department of Employment. He said, oh, well, Albert Booth has been offered it and has accepted it. Well, I said he would change. He'd be a marvellous Secretary of State for Energy, but on merit and seniority and capacity to pull the trade union movement together, I would do a better job. It'd be difficult for me, but I'd pledge my support. I could do it. Well, Michael was absolutely flushed with both embarrassment and some anger. And he said to me, well, you said you were ready to stay where you were. Well, I said that was on the assumption you wanted to stay where you were, but I would have liked the leadership of the House if you didn't want it. But if you're going up, then this is totally different. Well, he said, I'm afraid Albert's already accepted it. And of course, the truth is that there was a double deal, that Jim would block Roy Jenkins from going to the Foreign Office, which he did do by putting Crossland there. And secondly, that Michael would not press that I go to employment. And so anyway, I said, well, I'm just telling you that's what I'm going to do.
Good evening. Following my election as leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party, Her Majesty the Queen has invited me to form a government, and I have accepted that invitation. And my first engagement as Prime Minister is to give to you, the people of Britain, and to share with you my thoughts about our country and what we should be doing. To you all, I pledge my efforts, not only to re-establish our country's fortunes, but to uphold those values and freedoms we all care about.
I went down to see Jim in his room, and I said, Jim, I've thought about what you told me, but I want to be Secretary of State for Employment. Well, Jim said, I'm afraid I've already offered it to Albert Booth, and he has accepted it. I can't seem to be pushed around. I'm afraid it's too late. Well, I said, if you're not going to give me that, what about the Department of Environment? I'm afraid that's already offered and accepted. So I said, well, is everything gone? Yes, he said, everything is fixed, except for you, and I want you to stay where you are. So I said, well, may I say, because I want to be absolutely straight with you, Jim, that I resent the fact that I'm the only candidate in the leadership election who was not brought in, who was not consulted, and that you fixed the whole thing before you asked me in. And of course I realize now I made a terrible mistake in letting the last 2 or 3 days go by. I said, you know my views. I do not go in for leaks. I just make speeches and put out press releases. I said I was continually harassed by Harold Wilson. You look up the minutes he sent me about every minor thing. And I know you'll be different. You'll call me in, you'll bang the table, you'll threaten to sack me, but no more needling, please. And I said the trouble with Harold Wilson was that he was always built his team on what he thought were the weaknesses of his colleagues, not their strengths. He put one man in and someone else to undermine them. And I said, that's no way to do it. Got to build on the strength. Well, Jim said, you have a lot to offer. I make no promises, but I will consider what you've said for a later reshuffle. Well, he shook hands and said, the future is in your hands, but that's all rubbish. Well, I went back to my room, spoke to Joe Ashton, who said, of course, if you'd resigned last year, it would have been better, but he's quite wrong. Absolutely wrong, and he felt I'd been downed and humiliated and so on. Well, I don't know that I can be. You get to a certain point where you can't be humiliated if you're yourself. And I rang Carol to say I was coming home, and I came home, had a long talk to her. She was so sweet. Well, then, goodness me, I did my diary and cleared everything up, and it's now 2:15. So that is the end of Thursday, the 8th of April.
Looking back on it later, I was very glad I had not been moved to employment, because I would have been saddled with the job of enforcing wage restraint, to which I was completely opposed. But the more I thought about it, the more I became persuaded that the powers of the Prime Minister were far too great and should be curtailed. And I raised this issue at one of the husbands and wives dinners, which the so-called left used to hold at weekends for informal talks.
Sunday the 2nd of May, 1976. I went with Carol to the party at Michael and Jill Foot's. We got there about 8:30. It was a huge crowd, about 36 people there with their wives for dinner. And Michael looked terribly strained. I had a very interesting talk at dinner. Carol and I were side by side, and Albert Booth joined us later, and Ted and Barbara Castle were there. And we were arguing, and Peter Shaw was there, we were arguing about how to deal with this question of prime ministerial patronage. And I was developing the argument that we've turned democracy into an elected monarchy. And by God, we have, when you think that from 1964 through to 70, and from 1974 till he retired in 76, Harold Wilson must have given the ministerial office personally to an enormous number, I suppose, 200 or 250 members of Parliament, and created about 100 members of Parliament, that's to say peers. And this is a complete denial of parliamentary democracy. It is the king back in power via Parliament. And Parliament hasn't even got the right to decide who the new king's advisors are going to be, because it's all a prerogative power exercised by the Prime Minister in the name of the Queen. And the more one thinks about this, the more it seems this is the major battle to be fought. Therefore, you've got to deal with it by, first of all, having the cabinet elected by Labour MPs, secondly, by having Labour MPs more accountable to their local parties as well as their constituents, and thirdly, the question of whether the leader of the party should be elected by the conference is a matter of argument. I think there might be a case for having the leader of the party elected by the conference, because I am persuaded that you do the prime ministership. The premiership is in effect now 3 jobs. It's the chairman of the party, it's the chairman of the cabinet, and it's the leader of government business. And these 3 functions are quite distinct and clear functions. Barbara was saying, however, that Harold could do it all himself, and how Harold won in the cabinet by knowing more than any other minister, and he never went into the cabinet without knowing what he wanted to do, and so on and so on. Well, I said, I don't think you need to bother about that, because after all, there are other ways of doing it. Well, she said, you think of another way. Jim won't do his homework. Jim won't work as hard as Harold. You can catch him out. Well, I said, Jim just does it by picking the cabinet he wants, and that gives him the result he wants, which is exactly what Harold did. And Barbara said, but Harold was very clever. Look at the way he demoted you from energy. Look at that. To energy from industry. Look at that. I said, well, very clever. If you're the Prime Minister of the private patronage, you can do what you like. He just did what he liked. It was a very sort of tense discussion. And she said, I believe in patronage. That's what I believe in. I've no time for the Parliamentary Labour Party. I don't think that's a sensible idea at all to have them elected. And Peter agreed. And so I do think now the moment has come to launch a major battle on behalf of parliamentary democracy, as it ought to be. That's to say, to restore the power of Parliament over the executive, and of the parliamentary party over the parliamentary leadership. Quite an interesting thing, because it isn't particularly radical, but by God, if you did it, it would be revolutionary.
This is why a number of us came to the conclusion that we needed a campaign for greater democracy in Parliament and in the party, issues that were raised after Labour went into opposition 3 years later.